My name is Maxine, and at 34 years old, I never in a million years expected to be a widow. I never expected to wake up on a random Tuesday morning, reach my hand across the cool cotton sheets of my bed, and find nothing but empty space. You do not really understand the physical weight of grief until it moves into your house and sits on your chest every single morning. 3 months ago, I lost Vance, my incredible husband of 11 years, to a sudden brain aneurysm. One minute we were sharing our morning coffee, talking about picking up dry cleaning, and the very next, my entire world shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. The silence in our house after his funeral was absolutely deafening. I spent hours just sitting on the cold hardwood floor of our living room, staring blankly at his brown leather work shoes still neatly lined up by the front door. I could not bring myself to move them. I could not bring myself to do much of anything, really. I would wander into the kitchen, mechanically put 2 mugs on the counter out of pure habit, realize what I had done, and just slide down the cabinets to cry into my hands. But this story I am sharing with you today is not just about my grief. It is about what happened just days after I buried the absolute love of my life. I dragged my exhausted, heartbroken self to my nephew Alden's first birthday party. I did it out of sheer obligation. I did it because my mother called me crying, saying that family is supposed to matter, especially now. I walked into that backyard expecting forced smiles, plates of stale cake, and awkward condolences from people who did not know what to say to a young widow. Instead, my younger sister Jolene stood up in front of all our guests, her friends, and our parents, and dropped a bomb that made the ground completely drop out from under me. She announced, with a perfectly straight face, that little Alden was actually Vance's son. She stood there on the patio, wearing a brand new expensive floral dress, holding a folded piece of paper she loudly claimed was a newly discovered will. She demanded half of my $800,000 house as her son's rightful inheritance. She looked me dead in the eye across the yard, expecting me to crumble into a million pieces. She expected me to scream, to cry, to break down right there on the grass in front of the balloon arch. What Jolene did not know, what nobody in that yard knew, was why I had to physically bite the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper just to hold back my laughter. I looked at her, I looked at the fake piece of paper trembling in her manicured hand, and I simply said, "Oh, I see." To truly understand how insanely ridiculous her claim was, you have to understand exactly who Vance was and how our beautiful life together started. Vance and I met 12 years ago at a crowded charity auction benefiting children with cancer. I was 22 years old, volunteering at the event to build up my resume. I was running around the ballroom in a cheap, slightly itchy black dress, trying desperately to organize the silent auction items on the long folding tables. The room smelled like catered salmon and expensive perfume. I had been staring at this one particular piece of art all evening. It was a stunning watercolor painting of the Boston skyline at sunset. The artist had perfectly captured the vibrant oranges, pinks, and deep purples bleeding into the dark harbor water. I knew I could never afford it on my meager hourly wage, but I simply could not look away from it. Then, the live auction officially started. I stood by the coat check and watched a tall, incredibly handsome man in a sharp-tailored suit outbid a room full of wealthy donors for that exact painting. He did not even hesitate. Every single time someone across the room raised their numbered paddle, his paddle went right back up into the air. When the auctioneer finally yelled sold, he did not take the painting back to his assigned table. He picked up the heavy gold frame and walked straight across the crowded ballroom over to where I was standing. He stopped right in front of me and gently handed the frame over. He smiled, and I immediately noticed how his bright blue eyes crinkled deeply at the corners. He looked right at me and said he had noticed me looking at this painting all night long, and he thought it truly belonged with me. That was Vance. He was thoughtful, incredibly observant, and generous to an absolute fault. We went on our first official date the very next evening to a tiny, dimly lit Italian restaurant downtown. We sat in a small corner booth by the window for 4 solid hours. He told me all about his demanding work as a corporate attorney. He was brilliant, but he did not have a single ounce of arrogance in his body. When our waiter, an older gentleman named Tony, came over to pour our water. Vance asked him how his shift was going, remembered his name the entire night, and treated him with genuine, warm respect. I fell hard and fast right there over plates of pasta. Exactly 8 months later, he took me for a quiet walk along the harbor. The real sunset was mirroring the exact colors of the painting he bought me, and right there by the water, the man of my dreams got down on one knee and asked me to marry him. We bought our gorgeous Victorian home in Beacon Hill shortly after our first wedding anniversary. The house was a massive stretch for us financially at the time. It cost $800,000 and needed a completely new roof, updated plumbing, and serious cosmetic work. But Vance had just received a major promotion at his law firm, becoming a junior partner. His new salary made the heavy mortgage payments possible, and I was just starting to build a solid reputation of my own as an independent interior designer. We spent every single weekend covered in white paint and gray drywall dust, turning that old, drafty building into a warm home. It had beautiful, dramatic high ceilings and a small, overgrown garden out back. I spent countless hours standing by the kitchen window, wiping down the counters, looking out at that garden, vividly imagining our future children running around in the green grass. But those children never came. We did not fail for lack of trying, believe me. We spent years charting morning temperatures, planning our daily schedules around rigid ovulation cycles, and hoping with every single fiber of our beings. When natural methods completely failed us, we turned to the medical specialists. Our daily lives became a terrible blur of clinical waiting rooms with bad magazines, invasive physical tests, and painful procedures. We went through 4 full, exhausting rounds of IVF. It completely drained our savings accounts and it entirely drained our spirits. I remember the sharp sting of the hormone injections and the crushing disappointment of every negative test. I will never, ever forget the day of our final failed attempt. The nurse called me with a sympathetic voice I had grown to hate. We walked out of the clinic into the bright, mocking afternoon sun, and the drive home was entirely silent. I just stared out the passenger window, watching the neighborhood trees blur past, feeling completely hollowed out and broken. I felt like a failure as a wife. When we finally pulled into our driveway, Vance put the car in park, unbuckled his seatbelt, and reached across the center console. He took both of my trembling hands in his warm ones. He looked right at me with tears pooling in his own eyes and told me we can still have a beautiful life. He squeezed my fingers and said that having just me was enough for him. And the beautiful, rare thing about my husband was that he genuinely meant every single word. After we finally accepted that biological children were not in our cards, Vance and I slowly rebuilt our shattered dreams. We started over. We threw ourselves into renovating the rest of the house room by room until it was the exact showcase home I had always envisioned. I officially launched my own interior design firm, and Vance was my biggest cheerleader. We traveled to Europe, we hosted dinner parties, and our life was incredibly full, even if it was very different than what we had first planned. However, while Vance and I were building our peaceful life together, my younger sister Jolene was always hovering like a dark cloud in the periphery of our happiness. Jolene is 4 years younger than me, making her 30 at the time all of this horrific drama happened. Growing up, she was always the designated wild child of the family. While I was pulling exhausting all-nighters studying design and building a business from scratch, she was constantly bouncing between dead-end jobs and incredibly toxic relationships. She was undeniably beautiful. She had this effortless, magnetic charm that naturally drew people to her, but she used it as a manipulative weapon. Our parents constantly worried about her, and their intense worry somehow always translated into them making endless excuses for her terrible behavior. They bailed her out of financial trouble more times than I can even count. When she racked up $10,000 in careless credit card debt shopping for designer clothes, my father simply sighed and wrote a check. When she wrecked her car because she was not paying attention, my mother quickly co-signed a new loan for her. Jolene and I always had a deeply complicated relationship. There was this constant, exhausting undercurrent of bitter competition, entirely coming from her side. If I achieved something, anything at all, she immediately needed to one-up me or belittle it. When Vance and I bought our beautiful Victorian house and invited the family over for dinner, Jolene spent 3 straight hours complaining loudly over the roast chicken about her cramped, terrible apartment. She was clearly fishing for our parents to magically produce money for a down payment for her. It was completely exhausting to be around her energy. I frequently wanted to distance myself for the sake of my own peace, but Vance, sweet Vance, always encouraged me to keep the peace. He would gently rub my shoulders after they left and remind me that she was my only sister, and that family is important. About 2 years ago, Jolene started dating a guy named Blaine. She met him at a loud, sticky downtown club where he worked long hours as a bartender. Blaine was handsome in a very rough, unpolished sort of way. He had heavy, dark tattoos covering both of his arms all the way to the wrists, and he rode a massive, incredibly loud motorcycle that made our parents visibly cringe and clutch their pearls every single time he pulled into their quiet suburban driveway. Their relationship was a complete, volatile roller coaster from the very outside looking in. They had dramatic, screaming breakups on a Tuesday evening where she would pack all her bags, and then passionate, tearful reconciliations by Thursday morning. I honestly thought they were heading for a massive disaster, or maybe even a really messy custody battle or divorce if they ever actually got married. I tried to warn her once, sitting on her cheap couch, but she just rolled her eyes and told me I was too boring to understand passion. Then came our annual family Thanksgiving dinner the year before Vance died. We were all sitting around my large dining room table. The house smelled amazing. I had spent 2 full days cooking a massive 20-pound turkey, making homemade cranberry sauce, and preparing 4 different sides from scratch. Right as I was passing the bowl of hot mashed potatoes to my father, Jolene stood up from her chair. She tapped her crystal wine glass with a silver fork to get everyone's attention, burst into theatrical, glowing tears, and loudly announced she was pregnant. I completely froze. I felt my stomach drop straight through the hardwood floor. The familiar, burning, ugly sting of intense jealousy flared up hot in my chest. After all the needles, the painful hormones, the thousands of dollars spent, and the sheer heartbreak Vance and I had endured for years, my reckless, irresponsible sister had accidentally achieved the exact miracle we desperately wanted. I looked down at my china plate, taking a deep, ragged breath to aggressively push those selfish feelings down. I forced a wide smile onto my face, pushed my chair back, stood up, and walked around the long table to hug her tightly. I decided right then and there that I was going to be genuinely happy for her. I decided I would be the absolute best aunt possible to that innocent child, even if it broke my own heart a little bit every single time I looked at him. My nephew Alden was born on a dreary, rainy Tuesday morning. He was a perfectly healthy 8 pounds and 4 ounces. I was the very first person to arrive at the hospital waiting room. I brought a massive bouquet of bright yellow roses to cheer up the sterile room, and a soft, pale blue blanket I had spent 4 months painstakingly knitting by hand every evening while watching television. When I finally got to hold that tiny, warm baby in my arms, I felt an overwhelming wave of pure love wash over me. Jolene, however, seemed completely overwhelmed and utterly miserable from the very first day. Motherhood clearly did not come naturally to her. She called me constantly, usually around 2 in the morning, in absolute tears because Alden had severe colic and would not stop crying. She complained bitterly about her physical exhaustion, the lack of sleep, and the glaring fact that Blaine was rarely around to help her change a single diaper. I stepped in constantly to fill the gap. I regularly drove to her messy apartment after working a full 10-hour day at my design firm, gently took the screaming baby from her arms, and stayed up pacing the small living room floor with him all night long so she could finally get some uninterrupted sleep. I even went to my bank and opened a small college fund for Alden, depositing $50 every single month, wanting to make sure his future was secure regardless of his parents' chaotic choices. Vance, on the other hand, was surprisingly less involved with the new baby. Whenever Jolene brought the baby over to our house for family visits, Vance was always perfectly polite and kind. He would ask about his sleeping habits, but he never, ever offered to hold Alden. He kept a very distinct, physical distance, always standing near the doorway or sitting on the opposite sofa. I noticed it, of course I did. But I talked myself into believing that it was just too emotionally painful for him. I assumed that seeing me happily hold a baby that was not ours sharply reminded him of our own deep infertility struggles. I never pushed him to hold the baby, and I certainly never questioned his loyalty to me. Then came the terrible, ordinary Tuesday morning that changed my life permanently. It started just like any other day. I was standing in the bright kitchen making scrambled eggs and toast while Vance tied his leather dress shoes by the front door. He rubbed his temples with his fingers and complained about a severe, throbbing headache behind his eyes. He looked unusually pale and sweaty. I walked over, put my hand on his warm forehead, and practically begged him to stay home, take some medicine, and rest in bed. He stubbornly shook his head, grabbing his heavy briefcase. He had an incredibly important meeting with a major new corporate client and refused to cancel it at the last minute. He told me it was just a simple tension migraine from staring at contracts all week. He leaned down, kissed me softly and lingeringly on the lips, and promised he would call me the second the big meeting was over. I never got that phone call. Instead, 3 hours later, while I was looking at fabric swatches in my office, a nurse from the emergency room called my cell phone. Her voice was too calm. She told me I needed to get to the hospital immediately. I dropped my coffee mug, shattered it on the floor, and broke every single speed limit getting there. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the leather steering wheel. By the time I ran frantically through the sliding glass doors, demanding to see my husband, he was already gone. A massive brain aneurysm. The doctor put his heavy hand on my shaking shoulder, looked me in the eyes with profound pity, and said there was absolutely nothing anyone could have done to save him. He was only 36 years old. The next 5 days were a dark, suffocating, horrific blur. I moved through the necessary funeral arrangements like a hollowed-out ghost. I sat in a cold office and picked out a dark oak casket. I went into his closet and chose the navy blue suit he would wear forever. Through all of this agonizing, soul-crushing pain, my sister Jolene was strangely, glaringly absent. She sent me a brief text message the day after he died claiming Alden had a sudden fever. The day before the funeral, she texted again saying she could not find a reliable babysitter. When she finally showed up at the actual funeral service, she stood way in the back row. She kept entirely to herself, wore giant dark sunglasses the entire time, and slipped out the side door into the parking lot before the reception at my house even began. I was too numb with my own crippling grief to confront her about her awful behavior. Exactly 1 week after I stood in the cemetery and watched them lower my wonderful husband into the cold ground, little Alden turned 1 year old. The absolute last thing in the entire world I wanted to do was attend a loud, chaotic children's birthday party. I wanted to stay in my dark bedroom, wrap my body in Vance's old gray sweater that still smelled like his cologne, and cry into his pillow until I passed out from exhaustion. But my mother called my cell phone 3 times that morning. She used her most effective, guilt-inducing tone of voice. She insisted that Vance would want me to go and celebrate his nephew. She cruelly used his own words against me, reminding me that Vance always said family comes first. She told me I could not just hide from the world forever. So, feeling completely defeated, I dragged my heavy body out of bed. I took a shower but did not wash my hair. I put on a plain, shapeless black dress because I could not bear to wear color. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and applied thick, heavy layers of expensive concealer under my eyes to hide the dark, bruised-looking circles, but it barely helped at all. I looked exactly like a woman who had just buried her heart. I grabbed the wrapped wooden toy truck I had bought weeks ago, before my life ended, and drove slowly over to the less desirable part of town where Jolene rented her small house. I pulled onto her street and parked my car behind a long line of vehicles. I turned off the engine, gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, and took 10 deep, shaky breaths. I gave myself a silent pep talk. I told myself to just get through 1 hour. 1 single hour of putting on a brave face. I finally opened the car door, walked up the cracked concrete driveway, plastered a completely fake, tight smile onto my face, and knocked firmly on the front door. Jolene's best friend, Jenna, opened the front door. The moment Jenna saw me standing there in my black dress, her eyes darted away nervously. Her voice sounded tight, high-pitched, and incredibly awkward when she told me to come in and said that everyone was out in the backyard. Walking through the small living room, I immediately noticed a group of people clustered around the kitchen island. They were whispering intensely. The absolute second I stepped into the kitchen, their whispering stopped instantly. You could have heard a pin drop. Every single pair of eyes followed me as I walked past the counter. No one offered a sympathetic smile. No one said hello. My stomach immediately tied itself into a tight, uncomfortable knot. Something felt terribly wrong. I pushed open the screen door and stepped out onto the back patio. The small, patchy yard was heavily decorated with bright blue balloons and crepe paper streamers. A large, expensive-looking banner reading "Happy First Birthday Alden" was strung across the wooden privacy fence. I quickly spotted my parents sitting together at a plastic picnic table in the corner. They looked incredibly stiff and uncomfortable. When my father saw me, he stood up quickly, and I saw a flash of pure, undisguised relief wash over his tired face. He walked over, hugged me tightly, and whispered in my ear that they were not sure I would actually show up today. I set the wrapped toy truck on the designated gift table and asked my mother where the birthday boy was. My mother refused to meet my eyes. She stared intently down at her paper plate of potato salad and mumbled that Jolene was inside bringing him out for the cake soon. I spent 30 agonizing minutes making forced, awkward small talk with various guests. Every conversation I joined seemed to dry up the second I approached. If Blaine had threatened custody of Alden, or if there was some other massive family drama going on that I missed while I was grieving, no one was talking about it. The tension in the summer air was so thick it was hard to breathe. Finally, the back screen door swung open. Jolene stepped out onto the patio carrying Alden on her hip. I blinked in genuine surprise. She was wearing a stunning, obviously expensive new floral dress that fit her perfectly. Her hair had been professionally cut, styled, and highlighted. She did not look like a struggling single mother. She practically glowed with this bizarre, giddy confidence. She walked right past me without even nodding or saying hello, and placed Alden into his decorated high chair. Jenna quickly handed Jolene a metal spoon and a glass cup. Jolene tapped the glass loudly, the clinking sound cutting through the low murmur of the crowd. The chatter in the yard completely died down. Everyone turned to look at her. Jolene smiled broadly, a bright, rehearsed smile, and thanked everyone for coming to celebrate. She talked briefly about how challenging the past year had been for her as a mother. Then, her expression shifted. She took a deep, dramatic breath, placed her manicured hand gently on little Alden's head, and looked straight across the yard, locking eyes directly with me. She raised her voice so every single person by the fence could hear her clearly. She said she had been keeping a massive, heavy secret. She said, "Lucas is not Blaine's son." She pointed her finger directly at me, her eyes flashing with pure malice, and said, "He is Vance's son." A collective, loud gasp echoed through the backyard. I felt my father physically stiffen beside me. The rushing blood roared so loudly in my ears it sounded like a freight train. Jolene continued her perfectly rehearsed speech without missing a beat. She claimed she and my dead husband had a brief, passionate affair 2 years ago in a luxury hotel downtown. She called it a tragic mistake, a moment of weakness for both of them when my marriage was allegedly struggling. She said they never meant to hurt anyone, but these things happen. Then, she reached into her expensive new leather purse and pulled out a folded, crisp white document. She held it high in the air for all our friends and family to see. She announced that Vance knew the truth about the baby before he died. She said he felt guilty and wanted his biological son to be properly provided for. She declared that the document in her hand was Vance's officially updated will, stating clearly that half of the house Vance and I owned legally belonged to Alden as his inheritance. She stared at me, her chest heaving slightly, waiting for me to explode. She was waiting for me to scream, to cry, to call my lawyer on the spot, to completely lose my mind in front of everyone. Every single person in that yard, including my own parents, turned and stared at me in horrified silence. I looked at my sister. I looked at the fake paper she was waving around. I felt a strange, uncontrollable twitch at the corners of my mouth. A smile actually fought its way onto my face. It was not a happy smile. It was the dark, incredulous smile of someone watching a spectacular train wreck they knew was coming. I firmly pressed my lips together to stop the loud laughter bubbling up in my throat. I walked calmly over to her, politely asked to see the paper, quickly scanned the terrible, amateurish forgery, handed it back to her shaking hand, and simply said, "Oh, I see." Then, I turned around, walked through the silent house, and got into my car. If you are listening to this right now and your blood is boiling as much as mine was, please do me a favor. Like this video and comment the number 1 down below. It lets me know how awesome you are and shows that you are right here with me on this journey. Your support is a massive encouragement and truly motivates me to share the rest. Drop that one so I can recognize you, and now, let us get back to how I destroyed her perfect plan. Gemini said I walked away from that backyard, walked straight through Jolene's messy living room, and walked out the front door without looking back. I reached my car, unlocked the door with shaking fingers, and practically collapsed into the driver's seat. I slammed the heavy car door shut, locking myself inside the quiet, safe space. I gripped the leather steering wheel, leaned my head back against the headrest, and closed my eyes. And then, a sound escaped my throat. It started as a small, breathy hiccup, but it quickly grew. Within seconds, I was laughing. I was laughing so hard that tears were streaming down my face and my ribs physically ached. It was not a happy laugh. It was a chaotic, loud, disbelieving laugh born out of pure shock, intense grief, and the sheer, unadulterated audacity of my younger sister. I was laughing because there was a massive, foundational secret that Jolene did not know. There was a medical truth that Vance and I had never shared with a single soul, not even our own parents. That secret made her elaborate, dramatic lie not just incredibly hurtful, but scientifically and biologically impossible. The absolute truth about Vance and Jolene actually began 3 years ago, long before little Alden was even conceived. Vance and I had invited my sister over to our house for a nice Friday night dinner. We wanted to celebrate her getting a new job at a local marketing firm, which was a big deal since she could never hold down a job. Vance had spent 2 hours in the kitchen preparing his famous homemade lasagna, and we had opened a very expensive bottle of red wine to mark the occasion. We were all sitting around the dining room table, laughing and eating, when my cell phone rang. It was a wealthy client having a massive design emergency regarding some custom artwork, so I politely excused myself and walked into my home office. The phone call took much longer than I expected, keeping me away from the table for nearly 20 minutes. When I finally walked back into the dining room, the entire atmosphere had shifted. The air felt thick and uncomfortable. Vance was sitting stiffly in his chair, looking extremely tense. Jolene had moved her chair much closer to him. She had her hand resting casually on his forearm, and she was laughing loudly at something I had not heard. I honestly thought nothing of it at that exact moment. Jolene had always been overly affectionate, and we had all been drinking heavy red wine. But later that night, as we were standing in our bathroom getting ready for bed, Vance seemed deeply troubled. He sat down on the edge of our mattress, looked up at me, and said there was something he urgently needed to tell me. He took my hand and explained that while I was in the office on the phone, Jolene had actively made a pass at him. She made highly inappropriate comments about how lucky I was to have a successful husband, and then she boldly suggested that he deserved someone who could truly appreciate his passion. When Vance immediately and firmly rebuffed her advances, pulling his arm away, she just laughed it off. She tried to play it off as a joke, telling him that I was far too sensitive if he thought she was being serious. I was deeply hurt, but looking back, I was not entirely surprised. Jolene had spent our entire lives aggressively pushing boundaries. We naively decided to just let it go as an isolated, drunken incident. But it was not isolated at all. Over the next 6 months, Jolene constantly found sneaky ways to touch Vance whenever I was looking the other way. She sent him late-night text messages that crossed the line between friendly and highly flirtatious. One Tuesday afternoon, she even showed up at his law firm completely uninvited, wearing a tight dress, and asked him to take her out to lunch. Every single time she tried something, Vance gently but firmly maintained his strict boundaries. He never kept a secret from me, he told me immediately after every single incident. After she showed up at his office, we drove to my parents' house and confronted them about Jolene's escalating, toxic behavior. The conversation went terribly. My parents immediately went on the defensive. They firmly suggested that Vance was simply misinterpreting her friendly, sisterly gestures. My mother actually had the nerve to suggest that perhaps Vance was just feeling flattered by the attention from a younger woman and was exaggerating the situation to stroke his own ego. That night, driving home in the dark, Vance and I made a firm, united decision. We would aggressively create physical and emotional distance from Jolene. We politely declined any family invitations that included her. We made absolutely sure we were never, ever left alone in a room with her. Vance completely blocked her phone number on his cell phone after she sent a particularly suggestive message at midnight. And then came the medical issue that definitively changed the entire narrative. Vance had been experiencing severe abdominal pain for weeks before he finally agreed to see a specialist. The doctor diagnosed him with a varicocele, which is a painful enlargement of the veins within the scrotum that required immediate surgical intervention. The surgery went perfectly well, but the specialist strongly recommended that Vance undergo a vasectomy during the exact same procedure due to the extensive nature of the damage and the high potential for the painful issue to recur. Because we had already accepted our crushing infertility struggles, we agreed it was the smartest, healthiest choice for his long-term physical health. That vasectomy was successfully performed a full 2 years before little Alden was even conceived. We kept this deeply personal medical information entirely private. We did not tell a single soul. After enduring years of highly invasive, painful questions from relatives about our childless status, we had fiercely learned to protect our privacy. The only people on this earth who knew about the surgery were Vance, myself, and the medical staff at the hospital. It was biologically, medically, and scientifically impossible for my husband to father a child with my sister. The morning after that disastrous, horrific birthday party, I woke up before the sun even rose. I walked into the quiet kitchen, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and sat at the island. I thought about the time, right after his surgery, when Vance was sitting in our backyard garden. He was resting in a lawn chair with an ice pack discreetly positioned on his lap. He looked over at me with a very serious expression and made a prediction that seemed totally paranoid to me at the time. He told me that Jolene was not done. He said he had a terrible, sinking feeling in his gut that she might try something drastically damaging one day. I actually laughed at him, telling him he watched too many legal dramas, but Vance was dead serious. The very next week, he scheduled an official appointment with our family lawyer, Roland. I went with him to that meeting. I sat in a heavy leather chair and listened as Vance detailed every single piece of Jolene's inappropriate behavior, and then handed over his recent medical records confirming the vasectomy. Roland strongly recommended documenting absolutely everything. He told us to keep the medical records, the printed text messages, and the detailed timelines. Roland said it was always better to have thorough documentation and never need it, than to desperately wish you had it later. We followed his legal advice to the letter. We created a massive, comprehensive file. Vance also updated his official will properly through all the correct legal channels, making absolutely certain that every single asset would come directly to me in the event of his untimely death. Roland kept official copies of all the legal documents at his firm, and we placed the original copies in a secure safety deposit box at our local bank downtown. Vance jokingly called it our disaster preparation kit. When we locked the heavy metal box, he smiled at me and said he fully planned to be around to deal with any of Jolene's ridiculous drama for at least another 50 years. The memory of his smile made a fresh wave of tears slide down my cheeks into my coffee mug. At exactly 9 in the morning, I grabbed my purse and drove straight to the bank. The branch manager, a kind older man who had known Vance and me for years, expressed his deep, genuine condolences as he led me back to the secure vault. I sat completely alone in the small, quiet viewing room. I took a deep breath and opened the metal box. Inside was exactly what I desperately needed to destroy my sister's lies. I pulled out Vance's legitimate, legally binding will. It was fully notarized, properly executed, and explicitly left absolutely everything to me. Beneath that were the official hospital medical records detailing his varicocele surgery and the successful vasectomy, explicitly dated 2 full years before Alden's conception. I found a small leather journal where Vance had meticulously kept track of every single inappropriate interaction with Jolene. He wrote down the exact dates, the times, and the direct quotes of what she said to him. There was also a thick stack of printed text messages she had sent him late at night. And finally, resting quietly at the very bottom of the metal box, was a thick, sealed white envelope with my name written across the front in Vance's familiar, messy handwriting. My hands began to physically tremble. I carefully slid my finger under the paper flap, opened the envelope, pulled out the letter, and began to read. His words jumped off the page. He wrote, "My dearest Maxine, if you are reading this letter, something terrible has happened to me, and you have needed to access these private documents. I sincerely hope it is many, many years from now when we are both old and gray, and Jolene's crazy antics are nothing but a distant, funny memory we laugh about on the porch. But if not," he wrote, "if the absolute worst has happened and she has actually tried to hurt you in my physical absence, please know that I tried my hardest to prepare for every single possibility. Please use these legal documents to fiercely protect yourself. I know exactly how much you deeply value family, and I know how incredibly loyal you are to those you love. But you absolutely deserve to be protected from those who would selfishly take advantage of that beautiful, trusting heart of yours." He ended the letter by saying, "I love you beyond words, beyond time itself. Whatever happens, please always know that." Hot, heavy tears streamed down my face and dripped onto the wooden table as I read his beautiful words over and over again. I felt his intense, fierce love and his unwavering protection physically reaching out to me from beyond the grave. My intensely practical, incredibly thoughtful husband had actually anticipated this exact nightmare. He knew Jolene might try to use his death to her financial advantage, and he made sure I had the weapons to fight back. I wiped my face with a tissue. I carefully returned the journal to the box, but I kept exactly what I needed: the official copies of the medical records, the legitimate will, and a few selected journal entries. I placed them carefully into a manila folder, walked out of the bank, and immediately called our lawyer, Roland, to schedule an emergency appointment for that very afternoon. Roland's prestigious law office was located in a beautifully converted, historic brownstone in downtown Boston. It was the exact kind of high-end place that exuded old money, quiet power, and absolute discretion. I had only been to this specific office a handful of times with Vance over the years, but the elegant receptionist behind the polished desk recognized me immediately. Her professional expression instantly softened with deep, genuine sympathy. She stood up, offered me a bottle of cold water, and said that Mr. Roland was expecting me. She offered her condolences for my massive loss before guiding me down the long, carpeted hallway. Roland was a distinguished man in his late 60s. He had thick silver hair and wire-rimmed reading glasses perched precariously on the very end of his nose. He had actually been Vance's designated mentor when Vance first graduated from law school and joined the firm. They had maintained a very close, personal friendship even after Vance moved to a completely different corporate practice. When I walked into his massive office, smelling of rich mahogany and old books, Roland immediately stood up. He walked around his large desk and embraced me in a brief, comforting hug. He gestured for me to sit in one of the heavy leather chairs facing his desk. He looked at me with sad eyes and said he was completely devastated to hear the news about Vance, adding that my husband was truly one of the good ones. I agreed, my voice catching slightly in my throat. I swallowed hard and told him that it seems Vance was also entirely right about preparing for the absolute worst-case scenario regarding my sister. I opened my briefcase and calmly explained every single detail of what had just happened at the chaotic birthday party the day before. I described Jolene's grand speech, the shocked faces of our parents, and finally, I pulled out a photograph I had covertly snapped of the forged will she had aggressively presented to the crowd. Roland put on his reading glasses, took the photograph, and examined the document in silence for several long minutes. His professional expression grew increasingly stern and deeply concerned. He finally placed the photo on his desk and sighed. He told me that this was an incredibly amateurish, sloppy forgery. He pointed a pen at the paper and explained that the formal legal language was all completely wrong. It lacked standard clauses, and the formatting was a mess. He noted that the signature, while vaguely similar to Vance's handwriting at a quick glance, would never, ever stand up to a basic expert handwriting analysis. But, he added, leaning back in his heavy chair, the glaring fact that she intentionally created this fraudulent document at all is deeply, profoundly troubling. I nodded and opened my manila folder. I showed him the official documents I had just pulled from the safety deposit box. I handed over the hospital medical records strictly confirming Vance's vasectomy, the actual, legally binding legitimate will that Roland himself had drafted, and Vance's handwritten journal explicitly documenting Jolene's predatory behavior over the years. Roland slowly reviewed the thick stack of materials. A small, proud smile touched his lips as he murmured that Vance was nothing if not incredibly thorough. He tapped the medical file and stated that these hospital records alone completely and definitively disprove her insane claim about little Alden's paternity. He reiterated that the vasectomy was performed 2 full years before the child was even conceived, making it biologically and scientifically impossible for Vance to be the father. I took a sip of the cold water to moisten my dry throat. I looked at Roland and asked him what exactly I should do next. I explained that I did not necessarily want to humiliate her publicly and destroy the family, but I absolutely could not and would not let her steal half of our hard-earned home based on a vicious, calculated lie. Roland removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He told me that considering the extreme severity of the situation, we urgently needed more concrete information before making a move. He strongly recommended hiring a trusted private investigator to look deeply into Jolene's current, actual living situation. He explained that people rarely attempt massive, felony-level fraud of this specific nature without some intense, crushing financial pressure pushing them into a corner. He immediately recommended a man named Harlan. Harlan was a tough, former city police detective who now worked exclusively as a private investigator, often handling incredibly sensitive cases for Roland's prestigious law firm. I agreed without a single second of hesitation. Roland picked up his desk phone and made the call right then and there, explaining the bizarre situation in broad, sweeping strokes. Harlan arrived at the law office exactly 1 hour later. He was a stocky, solidly built man wearing a slightly wrinkled suit. He had a thick, unmistakable Boston accent and a very intense, no-nonsense attitude that immediately made me feel like I was in competent hands. We all sat around Roland's large conference table. I poured Harlan a cup of hot black coffee. He pulled out a worn, spiral-bound notebook and a pen. He listened quietly, taking incredibly detailed notes as I thoroughly explained the entire situation from start to finish. He asked very pointed, direct questions about Jolene's volatile relationship history, her spotty employment record, and her general financial status. As I tried to answer his rapid-fire questions, I suddenly realized how incredibly little I actually knew about my own sister's current, daily circumstances. Since Alden's birth, we had grown much further apart. My genuine attempts to be a highly involved, loving aunt were often rudely rebuffed, cancelled at the last minute, or simply taken completely for granted. I did not know where she shopped, who she hung out with, or how she was paying her monthly bills. When I finally finished speaking, Harlan flipped his notebook closed and stated that he would need a few solid days to dig into the dirt. He explained that his preliminary, immediate focus would be strictly on uncovering her true financial situation and tracking down the actual nature of her relationship with the child's biological father, Blaine. He looked at me sharply and asked if there was absolutely anything else I could tell him about this guy. I racked my exhausted brain. I shared what incredibly little I knew about Blaine. The tattooed bartender Jolene had been casually dating when she unexpectedly became pregnant. I told Harlan that I had only met the man a handful of awkward times, usually at forced holiday dinners, and he had always seemed completely uninterested in participating in any family gatherings. I mentioned that the absolute last I heard through my mother, they were supposedly still living together, but Jolene rarely ever mentioned his name in conversation anymore. I also pointed out a massive red flag. I told Harlan that Blaine was completely, glaringly absent from his own son's first birthday party yesterday. I told him I thought that was incredibly strange behavior for the father of the birthday boy, especially since Jolene was throwing such a lavish, expensive-looking party. Harlan nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he made another quick note in the margin of his book. He told me that was a very good, solid starting point for his investigation. He stood up, shook my hand firmly, and promised he would be in touch with the absolute truth very soon. The next 3 days were pure, unadulterated agony. I tried to focus on my interior design work. I sat at my home office desk, staring blindly at expensive fabric swatches and architectural blueprints, but my mind constantly raced back to Jolene's smug, triumphant face standing in that backyard. I could not sleep. I paced the empty, quiet hallways of my large house, listening to the grandfather clock tick, wondering what terrible secrets Harlan was unearthing in the dark. Exactly 3 days later, my phone finally rang. It was Harlan. He requested an immediate, in-person meeting at Roland's downtown office. When I arrived and walked into the large conference room, both men were already there. They were standing over the long table, deeply focused, reviewing a massive stack of printed documents spread across the polished wood. I sat down in a leather chair. Harlan looked directly at me, his expression grim. He told me that he had uncovered some incredibly concerning, highly detailed information about my sister's current living situation. According to his thorough financial investigation, Jolene was not just struggling, she was in absolute, dire financial straits. Harlan slid a paper toward me. He explained that she had aggressively accumulated over $75,000 in crushing debt. This massive number was spread across maxed-out high-interest credit cards, defaulted personal loans, and a mountain of unpaid medical bills for little Alden, who had apparently needed a specialized surgery for a minor heart defect shortly after his birth. Her credit score was completely abysmal, essentially ruined. Harlan noted that she had been officially rejected for 3 additional emergency loans from different banks in the past month alone. But that was not even the worst part. Harlan slid another official-looking document across the table. He told me she was currently facing immediate legal eviction from her rental home. I stared at the paper. It was a certified copy of the formal eviction notice her angry landlord had filed just last week. The notice clearly stated she had until the absolute end of the current month to pay 4 full months of back rent, plus late fees, or she and her baby would be forcefully ordered to vacate the property by the county sheriff. I felt physically sick to my stomach. I asked about Blaine. Harlan scoffed in disgust. He revealed that Blaine had apparently permanently abandoned Jolene and the baby shortly after Alden's birth. He had secretly packed his bags and moved all the way across the country to Seattle with a brand new girlfriend. He was court-ordered to pay a minimal, pathetic amount of child support, barely $200 a month, and he paid even that irregularly. Then, Harlan pulled out a thick stack of printed pages. He said he had also managed to find these. They were printouts of private text messages. Harlan explained that Jolene had been actively, openly telling her close friends about her calculated plans to fraudulently claim a large part of my house for several weeks. He handed me the transcripts. They were detailed messages between Jolene and her best friend, Jenna. I immediately recognized Jenna's name as the incredibly awkward woman who had opened the front door for me at the birthday party. The messages were absolutely damning. I read them out loud, my voice shaking with pure rage. Jolene wrote, "Vance dying is terrible, but maybe it is finally my lucky chance to get what I truly deserve." She continued, "That huge house is worth at least $800,000 now. If I play this completely right, I will have a massive nest egg for Alden and me." Jenna asked how. Jolene replied, "The fake will is almost ready. My friend Dave is amazing with Photoshop and he easily found a sample of Vance's signature online from some old charity auction program. It looks totally legit. Maxine has always been the golden child of the family. It is finally time for me to get my fair share." The final message read, "She got 11 amazing years with a great, wealthy guy. The absolute least she can do is share the wealth with her family now that he is gone." I dropped the papers onto the table. I felt physically ill reading the calculated, terrifying coldness of my own sister's typed words. This was not just a crime of sudden opportunism. This was meticulously premeditated, felony-level fraud completely designed to brutally capitalize on my agonizing grief. Harlan gently added that there was one more thing. He had run a full, national criminal background check on Blaine, the actual biological father. Blaine had an extensive, documented history of domestic violence charges stemming from a previous, violent relationship. Furthermore, he currently had an active arrest warrant out for thousands of dollars in unpaid child support for a completely different child living in New Hampshire. Harlan looked me in the eye and explicitly stated that Blaine was absolutely not someone I would ever want around my young nephew. If you have made it this far, please do me a favor, like the video and comment number 1 down below. It lets me know how awesome you are and shows that you are right here with me on this journey. Your support is a massive encouragement and truly motivates me. Drop that one so I can recognize you, and now, let us get back to my story. I sat in stunned, heavy silence trying desperately to process the mountain of horrible information. My sister was not just financially desperate. She was entirely willing to permanently destroy Vance's spotless professional reputation and drag our beautiful marriage through the mud just to violently solve her own self-inflicted financial problems. And her terrible choice in romantic partners had unknowingly put innocent little Alden in a potentially incredibly dangerous situation. I looked between Roland and Harlan, my voice barely a whisper, and asked what I should possibly do with all of this evidence. I told them I could not just expose all of this publicly to the police. Alden was completely innocent in all of this mess. He was still my blood nephew. Roland slowly removed his glasses, deeply rubbing the bridge of his nose. He leaned forward and told me I had several distinct legal options. We could easily take this file to the police and file formal felony charges against Jolene for attempted fraud and forgery. He assured me that would absolutely result in severe criminal penalties for her, highly likely including significant jail time given the massive dollar amount of the inheritance she was attempting to steal. Or, he continued, seeing the intense distress on my face, we could aggressively handle this entirely privately. We could force a confrontation with all the evidence, legally require her to completely retract her false claims, and potentially work out a binding legal arrangement that fiercely protects both my assets and the innocent child. I left that long meeting with a completely heavy heart, carrying a thick folder full of absolute destruction. That exact same evening, I paced the hardwood floors of my living room until my feet hurt. I picked up my phone and called my personal therapist, Dr. Chen, whom I had been seeing weekly since Vance's unexpected death. I urgently scheduled an emergency, late-night session. Sitting in her calm, quiet office filled with green plants, I completely unloaded the entire, unbelievable situation. I talked for 45 minutes straight without taking a breath. I looked at her and admitted that I was so incredibly angry I could barely see straight. I wanted to scream. I wanted to burn Jolene's life to the ground. But, I added, my voice breaking, little Alden is just an innocent baby. Absolutely none of this horrific mess is his fault. And despite everything she has done, despite the lies and the betrayal, Jolene is still my blood sister. Dr. Chen listened quietly and attentively, taking small notes. She asked occasional, probing questions about my complex relationship with Jolene throughout our entire lives. After I finished, she observed that this intense pattern of bitter competition and emotional manipulation has clearly existed since our early childhood. She told me that the current, extreme situation is simply a massive escalation, not an out-of-character anomaly. I looked at her desperately, tears welling in my eyes, and asked her what she would do if she were in my shoes. Dr. Chen smiled sadly. She softly replied that she could not tell me what specific decision to make. But, she leaned forward and said something that changed my entire perspective. She told me that genuine compassion does not ever mean allowing yourself to be continuously victimized. She said you can be a kind, forgiving person while simultaneously establishing incredibly firm boundaries and demanding severe consequences for bad actions. After a long, sleepless night of deep reflection, I finally decided on a firm course of action. I decided I would forcefully confront Jolene entirely privately. I would present her with every single piece of the overwhelming evidence. I would offer her a very clear, stark choice. She could either face the very real potential of felony legal consequences for her attempted fraud, or she could humbly accept a strict compromise that would financially provide for Alden's needs while demanding absolute, unwavering accountability from her. With renewed, fierce determination, I picked up my cell phone the very next morning and called Jolene. When she answered, I kept my voice completely neutral and cold. I simply said we urgently need to talk about the details of the will. I asked if she could please come over to my house tomorrow afternoon without the baby. Jolene let out a short, triumphant laugh. She sounded incredibly smug and entirely satisfied with herself when she replied that she knew I would eventually come around to see reason. She confidently told me she would be at my front door at exactly 2 o'clock. I spent the entire next morning meticulously preparing for her arrival. I arranged the massive stack of documents in a very logical, chronological order inside a thick black binder. Under Roland's explicit legal advice, I also set up 2 digital recording devices in my living room. Roland had strongly warned me that our state is a strict 2-party consent state regarding recordings. He explicitly explained that I absolutely could not record her in secret. However, he advised that I could simply ask for her verbal permission at the very start of our conversation. He suggested I frame the recording as a professional way to officially ensure we both have an accurate record of any financial agreements reached regarding the inheritance. At precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy brass doorbell rang, echoing through the quiet house. I stood in the hallway, closed my eyes, and took one massive, deep breath to steady my racing heart before opening the heavy front door. Jolene stood confidently on my porch. She looked incredibly polished, wearing another brand-new outfit and expensive shoes. Her immense confidence was glaringly evident in her straight posture and the smug little smirk playing on her lips. I kept my face completely blank. I told her to come inside, leading her directly into the formal living room. I had intentionally rearranged the furniture, setting up 2 heavy armchairs directly facing each other. I placed a glass coffee table between them. On the table sat a pitcher of ice water, 2 glasses, my thick black folder of documents, and the small digital audio recorder. I gestured for her to sit down. I poured the water and calmly stated that I hoped she did not mind if we officially record our conversation today. I kept my voice completely steady, explaining that it seems highly prudent given the serious, binding legal nature of what we are discussing regarding the house. Jolene hesitated for only a brief second, eyeing the blinking red light. But her arrogance quickly won out. She nodded dismissively and said, "Sure, whatever makes you comfortable, though I think this entire process can be pretty straightforward since the will is very clear." I reached out, pressed the record button, clearly stated the exact date and time into the microphone, and explicitly confirmed Jolene's verbal consent to be recorded. Then, I sat back in my chair, crossed my legs, and intensely studied my sister's face for a long moment. I told her that before we officially discussed dividing the house, I would like to clearly understand exactly what she is claiming happened between her and my husband. Without a single ounce of shame, Jolene launched directly into her highly well-rehearsed story about a supposed, passionate affair occurring exactly 2 years ago. According to her detailed version of events, she and Vance had deeply connected during a difficult period when he and I were supposedly having terrible marital problems. She confidently claimed they secretly met several times a week at an expensive hotel downtown. She spun a tale that Vance had tearfully confessed his profound unhappiness in our marriage, and that little Alden was miraculously conceived during one of these romantic encounters. She leaned forward, her eyes wide with heavily practiced sincerity, and claimed that he always truly meant to tell me the truth. She fabricated a lie that when Alden was born with his heart condition, Vance simply did not want to add massive stress to the difficult medical situation. But, she added with a fake sniffle, he always promised he would financially provide for his only son. I sat perfectly still and listened to her entire speech without interrupting her once. I mentally noted every single glaring inconsistency in her timeline, and the specific details that wildly contradicted what I absolutely knew about Vance's rigid work schedule during that exact period. When she finally finished her performance, I began asking highly specific, rapid-fire questions. I stared at her and asked exactly which hotel they supposedly met at. She replied far too quickly, claiming it was the Mandarin Oriental. I raised an eyebrow and asked what specific room number she remembered staying in. She faltered slightly, shifting uncomfortably in her chair. She vaguely waved her hand and said it was on a very high floor, but she did not recall the exact number. I continued to press her, my voice growing colder. I asked what specific days of the week they usually met. I asked what Vance typically ordered from the hotel room service menu. I asked exactly what side of the bed he preferred to sleep on. I asked if he typically showered before or after their encounters. I threw out highly intimate details that only someone who had actually, truly been intimate with my husband would absolutely know. Jolene grew increasingly flustered and visibly panicked. Her answers became incredibly vague, confusing, and completely contradictory. Finally, her fake composure cracked. She snapped loudly, asking why any of these minor details even matter. She aggressively pointed at the folder and yelled that the only point is that Alden is Vance's son, and the signed will proves Vance wanted to provide for him. I did not flinch. I calmly opened the black folder on the table. I looked her dead in the eye and stated that actually, both of those specific claims are demonstrably, legally false. I carefully pulled out the hospital records and placed them flat on the glass table directly between us. I explained, in a chillingly calm voice, that exactly 2 full years before Alden was ever conceived, Vance had a complete vasectomy following surgery for a varicocele. I pointed to the doctor's signature, noting that the surgery was completely successful and officially confirmed by multiple follow-up tests. I stated clearly that it was physically, medically impossible for him to father a child after that specific procedure. I watched as all the color completely drained from Jolene's face. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. She reached out with heavily trembling hands and picked up the hospital medical records. Her eyes desperately scanned the clinical language, the doctor's notes, and the undeniable dates. She dropped the papers back onto the table. Her voice was incredibly weak when she pathetically suggested that these records could easily be faked. I shook my head slowly. I replied that they are absolutely not faked, and that Vance's personal surgeon is fully prepared to officially testify to their absolute authenticity in a court of law if necessary. But, I added, leaning closer to her, that is just the beginning of the evidence. Next, I confidently produced the actual, legitimate will. It was fully notarized, stamped, and properly filed with the county court. I slid it over to her. I explained that this is Vance's actual legal will, professionally prepared by Roland and witnessed by 2 senior partners at his prestigious law firm. I pointed to the final paragraph, noting that as she can clearly see, it explicitly leaves absolutely everything to me, with absolutely zero mention of Alden. Jolene's false confidence was visibly crumbling into dust, but she attempted one last, desperate rally. She stuttered that he must have secretly changed it after this document was drawn up. She claimed the will she has is much more recent. I cut her off. I stated evenly that the will she has is a pathetic forgery, and a very poor one at that. I informed her that my lawyer has already officially identified multiple, glaring legal inconsistencies in the language, and a handwriting expert would instantly prove the signature is completely fake. I leaned forward, my voice turning to ice. I informed her that intentionally creating a fraudulent will is a serious felony in our state, legally punishable by up to 5 full years in a state prison. Then, I methodically presented the final nails in her coffin. I pulled out Vance's handwritten journal explicitly documenting her inappropriate, predatory advances over the years. I pulled out the printed text messages between her and Jenna openly discussing the Photoshop plan. And finally, I pulled out Harlan's comprehensive investigation report. I read aloud the devastating details regarding her crushing financial troubles, the $75,000 in debt, the active eviction notice from her landlord, and Blaine's complete abandonment of her and the child. I closed the black binder with a loud snap. I looked at her as she sat frozen in stunned, terrified silence. I told her that we know absolutely everything. I asked her what she thinks happens next. For a very long, agonizing moment, the room was completely silent. She did not speak. She did not move. Then, to my genuine surprise, her face crumbled and she began to cry. These were not the fake, theatrical, pretty tears I had seen her expertly use to manipulate our parents her entire life. These were deep, ugly, body-racking sobs of pure terror and defeat. She gasped for air. She looked at me, her mascara running down her cheeks, and finally said she honestly did not know what else to do. She sobbed that she is going to be completely homeless. She confessed that she and Alden will literally be out on the cold street in exactly 2 weeks. She cried that Blaine left them with absolutely nothing, and the crushing medical bills simply keep coming in the mail. She admitted she foolishly thought if she could just scare me into getting some money from the sale of the house, she could survive. My voice hardened into steel. I asked her if that desperation gave her the right to completely destroy my dead husband's spotless reputation. I asked if it gave her the right to tell everyone he viciously cheated on me, to forge legal documents, and to completely humiliate me. Her profound sadness suddenly twisted into bitter, defensive anger. She shouted that I simply have absolutely everything. She gestured around the room, yelling about my big house, my successful business, and everyone's constant respect. She cried that she has nothing but a sick baby, massive debt, and a terrifying eviction notice. She challenged me to try making good, moral decisions while living in that terrifying situation. Her loud outburst hung heavily in the air between us. The raw, ugly honesty of it, finally stripped of all the manipulation and lies, actually reached something deep inside me. It was not forgiveness, not even close, but perhaps it was a tiny sliver of understanding. I asked her, much more gently, to confirm that Alden is indeed Blaine's son. She nodded miserably, aggressively wiping her wet eyes. She admitted yes, and she finally confessed that Vance never, ever touched her. She admitted she did actively try to seduce him years ago, but he always shut her down immediately because he was so annoyingly, completely loyal to me. She confessed that her friend Dave helped her create the fake while using a signature found online, and she fully intended to use it to relentlessly pressure me into writing a check. She sobbed that she never, ever thought I would actually hire lawyers and look into the details so thoroughly. I reached over and turned off the digital recorder. I sat back in my chair, deeply considering my next, crucial move. Jolene watched me with wide, nervous eyes, clearly expecting me to call the police right then and there. I finally spoke. I told her that I could easily press felony charges today. I reminded her that what she did was highly illegal, incredibly cruel, and coldly calculated. She nodded miserably, whispering that she knew. But, I continued, my voice steady, putting you in prison would only deeply hurt little Alden. And despite absolutely everything you have done, he is still my nephew, and I love him very much. I leaned forward, making absolutely sure she was looking directly into my eyes. I laid out my strict, non-negotiable terms. I told her she is going to tell everyone the absolute truth. She will publicly admit that she entirely lied about the affair, that Alden is not Vance's son, and that she intentionally forged the legal will. I demanded she publicly apologize to me and to Vance's memory. She asked, her voice incredibly small, what happens after that, noting they will still be evicted. I told her I was not finished. I explained that in exchange for her full, public confession and signing a binding legal agreement never to attempt anything like this against me again, I will help them. Not by giving her half my house, but by legally setting up a secure trust fund exclusively for Alden's future education and medical needs, and I will temporarily help her secure a small, stable apartment. Her eyes widened in absolute shock. She asked why I would ever do that after what she tried to do to me. I answered honestly. I told her I am not doing it for her. I am doing it strictly for Alden, and because I know Vance would want me to ensure his nephew is safe, even if the mother tried to destroy us. But, I added sternly, there will be incredibly strict conditions. I demanded she enter intensive psychological therapy and mandatory financial counseling. I demanded she secure and maintain steady, verifiable employment with a real salary. And most importantly, I demanded she allow me to be a constant part of Alden's life to personally ensure he is being properly cared for. I explicitly warned her that if she violates even one single condition, the financial support stops immediately. Jolene sat quietly for a very long moment, heavily processing the massive weight of everything. She finally looked at the floor and whispered that she does not deserve my help. I agreed with her. I told her no, you do not. But Alden deserves a stable home, and I deserve to have my husband's memory completely untarnished. This specific solution gives us both exactly what we need. We spent another hour discussing the fine details. She finally agreed to every single term. We agreed to meet with Roland the very next day to formalize the binding contract, and I told her she would make her public confession at a mandatory family dinner I was hosting the following weekend. As I walked her to the front door, she paused on the porch. She looked at me, tears welling up again, and said she really is so sorry. She admitted she had been deeply jealous of me her entire life because everything always seemed to come so easily to me. I looked at her, exhausted to my bones. I replied that absolutely nothing about my life has been easy. I told her she just never bothered to look past the shiny surface. I gently suggested that maybe it is finally time she started doing exactly that. The mandatory family dinner I arranged for Saturday evening was incredibly tense from the very start. My parents arrived 30 minutes early. My mother walked into the kitchen carrying her signature baked lasagna, clearly using the heavy dish as a desperate peace offering. She set the hot dish on my counter, looking incredibly anxious. She told me she did not know what this meeting was about, but that Jolene had been calling them in tears all week saying I was forcing her to come over. I calmly poured her a glass of red wine and replied that she just needs to wait until absolutely everyone is sitting down. I told her this severe issue needs to be addressed exactly once, with everyone present in the same room. By 7 o'clock, we were all rigidly seated around my large dining room table. It was just my parents, Jolene, and myself. Alden was safely at home with a trusted babysitter. Under Roland's strict legal advice, a small digital recorder sat in the exact center of the dining table. I cleared my throat, thanked everyone for coming, and briefly explained that I was recording the conversation. Then, I turned to my sister. I stated that I have asked Jolene to share some incredibly important information with the family. Jolene looked incredibly pale and physically uncomfortable. Her usual arrogant confidence was completely gone. She stared down at her empty china plate, refusing to look anyone in the eye as she finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a shaky whisper. She said, I lied about Alden being Vance's son. She admitted that she and Vance never, ever had an affair. She confessed that Alden is Blaine's child, and she completely forged the legal will she showed everyone at the birthday party. My parents stared at her in absolute, horrific shock. My father slammed his hand on the table and demanded to know why she would ever do such an evil thing. He yelled, asking if she had any idea what that horrific claim did to her grieving sister, and to Vance's memory. Jolene began to cry again. She desperately explained her massive financial situation, her voice gaining a little strength as she detailed the mounting credit card debts, Blaine's cruel abandonment, and the terrifying eviction notice hanging over her head. As she spoke, I watched my mother's face. I could literally see my mother's expression rapidly shifting from initial shock right back into her usual, enabling sympathy. When Jolene finished, my mother immediately reached out and patted her hand. She said, "Oh honey, why did you not just come to us for financial help? You did not need to make up such terrible lies." Jolene looked at her bluntly and asked if they would have given her $400,000. She stated that is exactly what she would have gotten if her fraudulent plan against me had actually worked. My father shook his head, saying of course they could not give her that kind of massive money. But, he added weakly, they could have helped with the monthly rent, at least temporarily. He scolded her gently, saying instead she chose to try to criminally defraud her own sister while she was deeply grieving her dead husband. Jolene admitted she knew it was terribly wrong. She stated that I had already made that abundantly clear, and that I had the solid evidence to easily press felony charges against her and put her in prison if I wanted to. My mother immediately turned to me in absolute alarm. Her voice raised as she asked me if I would really do that to my own blood sister. I felt a massive flash of intense frustration at her immediate, reflexive defense of Jolene's criminal behavior. I looked right at my mother and stated firmly that even now, I absolutely could. I reminded her that what Jolene did was not just immoral, but it was highly illegal. I explicitly stated that forgery and fraud are serious felonies. My mother stubbornly insisted that she is family, and that she has an innocent baby to think about. I hit my breaking point. My voice rose loudly as I replied that I am family, too. I yelled that I am her daughter, too. I reminded them that I am the daughter who just violently lost her husband, and then had to exhaustively defend his memory against incredibly false accusations of infidelity. I demanded to know where their deep concern for my well-being was in all of this mess. My father looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting heavily in his wooden seat. He mumbled that of course they care about me, but argued that Jolene has simply always needed much more help and constant guidance. I asked him whose fault that actually is. I pointed my finger and told them they have been blindly bailing her out of her terrible, poor decisions her entire adult life. I firmly stated that maybe if they had actually let her face real consequences occasionally, she would not have confidently escalated to committing felony criminal behavior. My mother gasped loudly, clutching her napkin. She argued that my statement was hardly fair, claiming they have always treated us girls equally. Surprisingly, Jolene shook her head. She looked at our mother and said no, you have not. She admitted that I was completely right. Jolene confessed that they always made easy excuses for her, and always found quick ways to fix her massive mistakes. She admitted it did not help her at all, it just made her arrogantly think she could do whatever she wanted without facing any real consequences. My parents looked absolutely stunned at this raw admission coming from their golden child. For perhaps the very first time in her life, Jolene was actually taking full responsibility rather than deflecting the blame onto someone else. My father cleared his throat, looking nervously between us. He asked what happens now, specifically asking if Jolene is going to jail. I took a deep breath. I said no, I have firmly decided not to press criminal charges, but only under very specific, strict conditions. I thoroughly outlined the binding agreement Roland had drafted. I explained the locked trust fund for Alden, the mandatory therapy and financial counseling requirements, and the strict condition regarding stable employment. My father let out a massive sigh of relief, stating that my offer is incredibly generous. He added, especially after the terrible things she did. Jolene agreed quietly, stating it is far more than she actually deserves. My mother immediately brightened up, clapping her hands together. She enthusiastically said this is all working out for the best. She smiled, saying Jolene has apologized, I am helping with Alden, and we can quickly put this ugly business completely behind us. I stopped her right there. I looked at my mother and stated firmly that it is absolutely not that simple. I explained that deep trust has been severely broken here. I told them that any real healing will take a massive amount of time, if it ever happens at all. And, I added, there need to be incredibly strict boundaries going forward with everyone in this room. My mother looked worried, asking what kind of boundaries. I looked at both of my parents. I told them that for one thing, I need them both to immediately stop blindly enabling Jolene's behavior. I demanded no more financial bailouts, and absolutely no more excuses. I stated she needs to finally stand on her own 2 feet with appropriate, professional support that does not perpetuate her endless dependency. My father nodded slowly, agreeing that seems very reasonable. Then, I told them I need them to fully respect that my relationship with my sister will be fundamentally different now. I explained I am highly involved in Alden's life strictly because I love him and want the absolute best for his future. But, I clarified, Jolene and I will not be close the way we once supposedly were. At least not for a very long time. My mother looked deeply distressed. She argued that we are a family, and we need to stick together. I spoke very gently but firmly. I told her that merely being blood family does not ever mean endlessly tolerating abuse. I explicitly stated that what Jolene did was highly abusive. She intentionally tried to use my crushing grief to manipulate me and take advantage of me at my absolute most vulnerable moment. I concluded that actions like that have severe consequences, even within a family unit. The remainder of the dinner was incredibly subdued, with my parents quietly processing this harsh new reality. When they finally left, my father hugged me tightly by the door, whispering in my ear that he is incredibly proud of me, and that he knows Vance would be too. My mother hugged me as well, but her eyes were very sad, clearly mourning the idealized, perfect family dynamic she had always stubbornly pretended we had. Jolene was the last person to leave. She hesitated at the front door. She looked at me and said she really is sorry. She clarified she was not just sorry for the fake will and the lies, but for absolutely everything. She apologized for the years of petty competition and jealousy, and for not being the supportive sister I truly deserved. I told her I know. I told her I sincerely hope the intense therapy helps her deeply understand exactly why she made these terrible choices. I reminded her that Alden deserves a mother who is emotionally healthy and completely honest. She asked, her voice trembling, if I think I will ever fully forgive her. I considered her heavy question carefully. I answered truthfully, telling her I honestly do not know. But, I added, I am willing to see exactly where this new, honest path takes us. I told her I am doing it for Alden's sake, and maybe, just maybe, someday for ours, too. Exactly 1 full year after Vance's sudden death, I stood alone in our backyard garden, peacefully watching the early spring bulbs push aggressively through the dark soil. The bright yellow daffodils that Vance had carefully planted the previous fall were finally blooming. They were a massive, beautiful riot of yellow against the newly green lawn. I felt a deep, bittersweet ache in my chest seeing them, knowing he had put them in the cold ground with high hopes of seeing them bloom with me. So much had drastically changed in that single, exhausting year. The Educational Trust Fund for Little Alden was officially established and was already heavily helping with his ongoing, expensive medical needs. His heart condition, while still requiring strict monitoring by specialists, was responding incredibly well to the new treatment, and he was rapidly growing into a cheerful, wildly curious toddler. Jolene had actually surprised absolutely everyone, including myself, by truly embracing the strict conditions of our binding legal agreement. 6 solid months of intensive psychological therapy had helped her clearly recognize the toxic patterns of behavior stemming from our childhood. She was finally confronting her constant, exhausting need to aggressively compete with me, and the deep self-sabotage that had characterized so many of her terrible life decisions. She had successfully found steady, reliable employment working as an office manager at a busy local dental practice. It was a solid job that provided her with financial stability and much-needed health benefits. Our personal relationship remained highly formal but entirely cordial. I saw Alden very regularly, joyfully taking him for long outings to the city park or the children's museum. Jolene and I absolutely did not pretend to be close best friends, but we had successfully found a functional way to peacefully coexist strictly for Alden's sake. My parents had struggled mightily initially with the strict new boundaries I had firmly established. My mother especially found it incredibly difficult to finally accept that her two daughters would not have the close, perfect relationship she had always wildly envisioned in her head. But over a lot of time, they too had slowly adjusted, finally learning how to properly support Jolene without blindly enabling her financial dependency. As for my own healing, the local grief support group I had joined shortly after the funeral had become an absolute lifeline for me. 12 complete strangers, bound tightly together by massive loss, had become very close friends. They understood my complex pain in deep ways that even my well-meaning family could not. We met weekly in a church basement, sharing our messy journeys through grief, celebrating small victories, and heavily supporting each other through the inevitable, crushing setbacks. 3 months after the massive confrontation with Jolene, I used a portion of our savings to officially establish the Vance Preston Foundation for Legal Education. The foundation focuses on providing massive scholarships to bright students from underprivileged backgrounds who are highly interested in pursuing corporate law. It gave me an incredible sense of deep purpose to actively see Vance's legacy continuing in the promising careers of young, idealistic lawyers who might otherwise never have had the financial opportunity to enter the profession. My old friends had stepped up in beautiful ways I could never have fully anticipated. Vance's former law partners checked in on me regularly, kindly inviting me to dinners and events, making absolutely sure I was not sitting isolated in my heavy grief. And then, there was Michael. I first met him at a crowded fundraiser for the foundation, about 6 months after Vance died. He was a highly respected professor of ethics at Boston University. He was incredibly thoughtful and kind, with a quiet, dry sense of humor that strongly reminded me of Vance in some small, comforting ways. We started strictly as friends, sharing hot coffee after foundation board meetings, and then gradually, very slowly, transitioned to occasional, quiet dinners. It was very different than the fierce, intense love I had with Vance, and I knew that was exactly as it should be. Michael completely understood that Vance would always be a massive part of my life. He understood that loving someone again did not ever mean replacing what beautifully came before. We were taking things incredibly slowly, both of us highly cautious but genuinely hopeful for the future. Standing in the quiet garden that beautiful spring morning, I deeply reflected on absolutely everything Vance had taught me. He taught me so much, not just during our wonderful years together, but even long after he was physically gone. His incredible foresight in preparing those legal documents had fiercely protected me when I was at my absolute most vulnerable. His detailed journal entries had strongly validated my frustrating experiences with Jolene when my own parents desperately tried to dismiss them. His massive love continued to shield me, even in his physical absence. I had learned incredibly difficult, painful lessons through this massive ordeal. I learned that family relationships absolutely need clear, firm boundaries to remain healthy. I learned that legal documentation is not just a smart precaution, but sometimes an absolute emotional necessity. I learned that genuine forgiveness does not ever have to mean forgetting the past or allowing harmful, toxic patterns to blindly continue. And tragically, I learned that sometimes the exact people we naturally expect to protect us are the very ones we urgently need protection from. But through the darkness, I had also learned about my own immense strength. I had bravely faced Jolene's horrific betrayal, expertly navigated the complex legal issues, and made incredibly difficult, firm decisions about how to move forward, all while heavily processing the devastating loss of my husband. I had successfully found a beautiful way to honor Vance's memory while slowly beginning to build a brand new life for myself. The bright yellow daffodil swayed gently in the warm spring breeze, incredibly resilient after the long, freezing winter. I thought about how the process of grief is exactly like that, too. It is absolutely not a straight line, but a series of changing seasons, each bringing its own massive challenges and unexpected, quiet beauties. I was not the exact same person I had been before Vance died, and I was not the same person I was before Jolene's betrayal. I was much stronger in some ways, far more cautious in others, but ultimately much more authentic in how I aggressively approached my relationships and my boundaries. Sometimes, the absolute most painful betrayals force us to find a well of strength we never knew we had. I looked up at the clear blue sky and spoke softly to the quiet garden that Vance had loved so much. I whispered that he could not have fully known exactly what would happen after he was gone. But somehow, I said, you perfectly prepared me to face it head-on. And in that beautiful way, your love strongly protects me still. As I turned around to go back inside my warm house, I finally felt a deep sense of profound peace that had been completely absent for so very long. It was not because the heavy grief was entirely gone. It never would be completely. But it was because I had successfully found a way to carry that grief alongside a bright, beautiful hope for the future.